A pregnant woman decided to replace the insulation in the attic of an old house where her husband's parents once lived. But under a board, she discovered a hiding place that had been waiting for decades. What was hidden inside changed everything. Subscribe, write in the comments which city you are from, and share this video with your friends. The road curved through the narrow valley like a quiet memory, its surface broken and uneven, where moss and roots had begun to reclaim what once belonged to men. The car climbed slowly between tall pines, whose branches tangled overhead, blotting out most of the pale afternoon light. Inside, the woman sat beside her husband in silence. Her hands rested on the gentle curve of her stomach, feeling the small, rhythmic movements beneath. The child was awake, as if it too could sense that something important waited at the end of the road. The man's face was motionless, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his jaw set tight. Every mile seemed to pull him further away from the life he had built in the city and closer to the one he had tried so hard to forget. The woman turned her head toward the window. The forest was dense, the air outside tinted with mist, and every now and then, she caught a glimpse of the lake, cold and gray, like tarnished glass stretching beyond the trees. She had seen photographs of this place once, long before they married. It was where her husband had grown up, in a house his parents built with their own hands. They had died years ago, one after the other, leaving the property untouched and quiet, a sealed fragment of his past. He had promised himself never to return, but promises made to pain are brittle things. Now, with their child on the way, the city had begun to feel suffocating. Too small, too loud, too temporary. They had come here not to chase ghosts, but to find space to breathe again. When the car finally stopped, she looked out and felt her chest tighten. The house stood at the top of a small incline, surrounded by tall grass and patches of wildflowers. The paint on the wooden boards had long since faded, and the roof was blotched with moss. The windows were clouded with dust, and ivy had crept up the porch columns. Yet even in its ruin, the place had a quiet dignity, as if waiting for someone to wake it from a long sleep. Her husband stepped out first. The gravel crunched under his boots. He didn't look at the house. Instead, he opened the trunk, pulling out their bags and tools in silence. The woman followed slowly, one hand on her back, her breath visible in the cool air. From up close, she could see small details that photographs never captured: the delicate carving on the porch railing, the initials scratched into the front door, the faint scent of cedar that lingered despite the years. The key turned in the lock with a groan, and the door swung inward. A draft of stale, dry air greeted them, carrying the scent of wood, dust, and something faintly sweet like forgotten apples. The interior felt frozen in time. A thin layer of dust covered everything: the dining table, the armchair by the window, the framed photographs on the wall. She brushed her fingers along a picture frame and saw the image of a man and woman smiling in front of this very house. The same porch, the same view of the pines behind them. The man's arm was around a young boy, no more than 8. Her husband glanced at it briefly, and then turned away. He didn't want to linger. She could see the shadow of emotion pass over his face before he hid it behind the mask of practicality. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through each room. The floors creaked under their steps, the windows stuck when opened, and the walls held the faded smell of warmth and memory. It wasn't just a house. It was a place that had absorbed laughter, arguments, birthdays, grief. Even in silence, it was full of echoes. By evening, when the last light bled through the trees, they found themselves sitting on the front porch. The woman held a mug of tea between her palms. The steam rose gently, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. Her husband leaned on the railing, his shoulders heavy, his gaze fixed on the distant lake. "We could make it livable again," she said quietly. "It just needs care." He didn't answer right away. The sound of the wind moving through the forest filled the space between them. Finally, he said, "My father built this house board by board. After he died, I couldn't step inside without hearing him. My mother tried to keep it the same. When she was gone, it felt wrong to touch anything, like changing it would erase them." His voice was low, almost ashamed. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. "Maybe it's time to let it live again," she said. "For them. For us." In the following days, the rhythm of their new life began. He worked outside, cutting down overgrown branches, repairing the broken fence, clearing the gutters. She moved slowly through the rooms, sweeping, airing out the curtains, washing the old dishes one by one. The physical act of cleaning felt almost ceremonial, as if each motion brushed away a layer of silence. Sometimes, she would find small traces of his parents, a scarf folded neatly in a drawer, a note pinned behind the door, a jar of preserves long hardened into sugar. She treated each object with quiet respect, feeling as though she were touching someone's memory. At night, they would light a fire in the hearth. The old chimney moaned as it breathed again, releasing the smell of burning pine and smoke. She would rest her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. The house no longer seemed as cold, yet she noticed that her husband rarely looked at the family photographs that lined the walls. His eyes always passed over them quickly, as though glancing too long would open a wound he wasn't ready to face. Once when he caught her staring at one of the pictures, a boy sitting on his father's lap beside a half-built porch, he said softly, "That was the summer he finished the roof. I remember holding the nails for him. I dropped one, and he laughed like it didn't matter. It's strange the things you remember." Then he fell silent again, his expression unreadable. As the weeks passed, the woman grew attached to the sound of the house, the whisper of wind through the attic, the groan of the floorboards at night, the occasional distant creak from above. She didn't find it unsettling. Instead, it gave her comfort. The noises felt like breathing, like proof that the house was still alive. Sometimes, she imagined the spirits of those who had once lived here, not haunting, but watching, quietly relieved that someone had finally come back. Her pregnancy filled the space with an unspoken anticipation. She often placed her hand on her belly and spoke softly, telling the baby about the house, the trees, the lake. She wanted her child to know peace, to grow up surrounded by the quiet honesty of wood and stone. "This will be our beginning," she whispered one evening, while her husband was away buying materials. The fire crackled in the hearth, and she felt a sense of resolve forming inside her. The house had waited long enough. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start from the top. From the attic her husband refused to touch. The next morning, light seeped through the curtains, thin and golden. The air smelled of rain. She climbed the narrow staircase that led to the upper floor, one careful step after another, holding the railing as her weight shifted forward. At the top, a small door opened to the attic. She pushed it gently, and a gust of cool air met her face. Dust hung suspended in the sunlight, like drifting pollen. The space was larger than she remembered from his stories, slanted beams, low ceiling, boxes stacked in corners, and old insulation laid thick between the rafters. Everything was covered in a film of gray, untouched for decades. She stood there for a long time, listening. The silence was deep, but not empty. It had texture, as if it carried whispers. When she finally moved, it was with care, her steps deliberate. She picked up a broom and began clearing a path through the dust. With each sweep, more light entered through the small circular window at the far end. She could hear the faint hum of her own breath, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, and beneath it all, the faint stirring inside her belly, a reminder that she was not alone. As she worked, she noticed how the air felt heavy in some corners, lighter in others, as if the house itself had its moods. The insulation was rough, yellowed with age. She pulled at a section near the center beam, expecting only dust, but the sound that followed was hollow. She paused, leaning closer. Her fingers brushed over a plank that seemed different smoother, slightly raised along one edge, as if someone had once cut it deliberately and then nailed it back. A slow, almost instinctive realization spread through her. She knelt down, her knees pressing into the cold wood, and ran her hand along the seams. Beneath the insulation, beneath the dust, the house was holding something. She could feel it, a secret kept in silence for half a century. For a moment, she hesitated. The air felt charged, like the pause before thunder. Then she whispered to the child inside her, "We'll find out together." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows. The faint scent of pine drifted through the cracks. She reached for a nearby crowbar leaning against the wall, the same one her husband had used days earlier while fixing the porch. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange gravity of the moment. When she pressed the edge of the tool under the loose board, the wood groaned, reluctant to give way. She pushed harder, and the nail heads squealed as they lifted. The sound echoed softly across the attic, like a sigh. She pried the board loose, exposing darkness below. Dust fell like fine snow into the gap, and for a second, all she could see was the faint glint of something metallic. Her breath caught. Whatever was hidden here had been meant to stay untouched. Yet now it was calling to her, just as the house had called since the day they arrived. She leaned forward, her hand trembling as it reached toward the hollow space. The object inside was cool under her fingertips, heavy and solid. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the years of dust. It was a box metal, dull yellow in color, with a rusted padlock clamped to its front. She stared at it, her reflection faintly visible in the tarnished surface. Her heart pounded, echoing in her ears. She didn't know what she had found, but deep down, she felt that it wasn't just an object. It was something that had waited for her. Not her husband, not anyone else, but her. Cradling the box against her chest, she stood slowly. Her back ached, but she barely noticed. The light through the attic window had turned soft and amber, casting long shadows along the beams. She took one last look around the room before turning toward the stairs. Below her feet, the house creaked again, as if acknowledging what had just been disturbed. When she reached the bottom step, she paused, listening to the distant echo of wind through the eaves. Her hands rested protectively on the box, and she whispered to the child inside her, "Whatever this is, it belongs to your family. Maybe it was meant for you." The house, once silent, seemed to exhale in response. A faint groan of wood, a whisper through the cracks. The woman smiled faintly. For the first time since arriving, she felt as if the house was awake. And though she didn't yet know it, what she had found beneath that board would change everything that followed. She walked toward the kitchen, the box heavy in her arms, and the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the walls. Upstairs, the loose plank she had lifted settled back into place with a slow, final sigh, as if closing the first page of a story that had only just begun. The late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window as she placed the metal box on the table. Its surface was rough, pitted with rust, and cold to the touch. She stood still for a long time, her palms resting on the edge of the table, her breath slow and uneven. The child inside her turned once, as if responding to her pulse. It felt almost as though the two of them, the living and the unborn, were caught together in the same suspended silence. The house seemed to be listening too. From somewhere deep within the walls came the slow ticking of an old clock that hadn't worked when they first arrived. Now, inexplicably, it sounded faintly, marking each second with the patience of time that had never really stopped. She sat down and studied the box closely. The lock was small but stubborn, its shape eaten by corrosion. She tried to pull at it gently, but it wouldn't move. The metal felt solid, almost defiant, as if it had guarded its contents for too long to surrender easily. She ran her thumb along the edge of the lid, feeling the faint ridges of a craftsman's hand. Perhaps her husband's father had built it himself. Everything in this house bore traces of him. The carefully cut beams, the old carpenter's bench in the shed, the tools still hanging on nails like silent witnesses. The box, she realized, could be his work as well. She went outside to the porch to fetch the toolbox. The sun had dipped behind the pines, and the air was turning cool. In the distance, the sound of a truck engine echoed faintly along the road. Her husband would not return for another few hours. She felt both relief and guilt at the thought. Whatever was hidden inside this box, it felt personal, intimate, something that perhaps should have waited for him. But curiosity was a force she could no longer resist. The discovery had changed the rhythm of her thoughts. Even as she breathed, the idea of what might be inside pulsed quietly in her mind, like a second heartbeat. She brought the bolt cutter from the shed, its handles coated in dust and grease. The first attempt barely scratched the steel. She adjusted her grip, leaned forward and pressed harder, her body weight shifting against the resistance. The metal groaned but held. Sweat gathered at her temples, and she stopped to catch her breath. She felt the ache in her lower back, the heaviness that came with the final months of pregnancy. The baby stirred again, and she smiled faintly. "We'll see it together," she whispered. On the third attempt, the lock cracked with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the kitchen. She froze, half expecting the sound to wake something else in the house. But nothing moved. The air remained still. Slowly, she set the bolt cutter aside, wiped her palms on her jeans, and placed her hand on the lid. For a moment she hesitated, her heart beating in her throat. Then she lifted it. Inside wasn't treasure, at least not in the way the world defined it. A thin layer of fabric covered the contents, yellowed with age and smelling faintly of cedar and dust. She peeled it back carefully. Beneath lay stacks of envelopes tied with faded string, a few small photographs curled at the edges, and several thin books, bound in worn paper comic books, she realized, the kind printed long ago, their color still faintly visible despite time's hand. Her husband's father must have collected them as a boy, maybe even hidden them away to keep them safe. But there was more. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in an old handkerchief, lay a single sealed envelope. Its paper was brittle and cream-colored, its edges browned. The handwriting on the front stopped her breath. It was simple, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. The ink had faded, but was still legible. "Open when you have your own child." Her hand trembled as she lifted it. The words seemed to hum with quiet meaning. For a moment she imagined the man who had written them, her husband's father, sitting in this same house, perhaps at this same table, pen in hand, knowing that he would never see the future he was addressing. She looked toward the window, where the faint reflection of her rounded stomach showed in the glass. The message was not meant for her, and yet it was. The unborn life inside her was part of this family now. This letter, untouched for decades, was speaking through generations. She unsealed the envelope carefully, afraid it might crumble. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper, written in the same steady hand. The first words were simple. "If you are reading this, it means there is a child on the way, and that is enough reason to believe in tomorrow." Her throat tightened. The letter went on in an even, thoughtful tone, more like a conversation than a confession. The writer spoke of work, of the sound of hammers on wood, of how building a home was like raising a family. It took patience, trust, and the will to start over every morning. He wrote about fear, too. Fear of failure, of not being enough, of the day when his son might walk away and never return. I was not good at saying what mattered, he admitted. But love is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in the things we build, the walls we raise, the roofs that keep others safe. Maybe one day you'll understand that silence was not distance. It was effort. Tears blurred her vision as she read. She could picture him, a man who worked with his hands, leaving behind something that would outlast him. A letter that was not about inheritance, but about faith. Near the end, the words became more fragile, more personal. When laughter fills this house again, I'll know you've forgiven me for the things I couldn't say. When you hear your child's footsteps here, you'll hear mine too. The woman pressed the letter to her chest, her breath catching. The baby shifted again inside her, almost as if the words had reached through time to touch them both. She sat in silence for a long while, letting the meaning settle in her heart. By the time the sound of a car pulled into the driveway, the sky had turned dark blue. She folded the letter carefully, returned it to its envelope, and placed it beside the box. Her husband stepped through the door, carrying a bag of groceries. His face was tired, but softened when he saw her. "You've been working again," he said, glancing at the dust on her sleeves. She nodded. Her voice came out quiet but certain. "I found something." He set the bag down and followed her gaze to the table. When he saw the box, his expression changed. He walked closer, slowly, as if afraid of what he might see. "That was his," he said, almost to himself. "I remember that box. He kept it under the bench in the shed." He touched the edge with his fingertips, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. "You opened it." She nodded again, unsure of what to say. "There's a letter," she whispered. "He wrote it for you." He didn't move for several seconds. Then, with hands that shook slightly, he picked up the envelope. His thumb traced the faded words on the front. When he opened it, she saw his eyes flick back and forth across the lines, reading slowly. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. When he reached the final sentence, his lips parted, but no sound came. He folded the letter back carefully, laid it on the table, and covered his face with his hands. She went to him then, resting her hand on his shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke. He lowered his hands and looked at her, his eyes glassy but clear. "He always wanted me to come back," he said. "I didn't. I couldn't. After he died, I told myself there was nothing here for me. But he knew I'd return one day. He knew before I did." He placed his palm on her belly, feeling the small movement beneath. His voice broke slightly. "He wrote this for him, for us." The firelight flickered across the walls, illuminating the faces in the old photographs that lined the room. The house, once silent, seemed to be breathing again. Shadows danced on the ceiling like memories brought back to life. Later that night, after he had gone upstairs, she stayed behind in the kitchen. The open box sat on the table, its contents neatly arranged. The letters, the drawings, the photographs, the comics. Tokens of a life preserved in secrecy. She imagined the man who had placed them there, the steady rhythm of his hammer outside, the quiet way he might have smiled at his wife while hiding this small part of himself away. Perhaps he hadn't meant it as a mystery, but as a gift, a reminder that some things only reveal themselves when the heart is ready to understand. The wind outside rose softly, brushing against the windows. The old clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, patient and forgiving. She stood, turned off the light, and climbed the stairs. The wooden steps creaked beneath her feet, but the sound no longer startled her. It was the voice of the house itself, acknowledging her presence, accepting her as part of its story. In the bedroom, her husband was asleep, one arm draped across the empty space beside him. She lay down quietly and placed the folded letter on the nightstand. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling the gentle rhythm beneath her palm. In the darkness, she thought of the generations that had passed through these walls, of the laughter, the silence, the work, the love unspoken yet never lost. She realized then that the house had not been waiting for repairs or for light. It had been waiting for a heartbeat, for life to return. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered to the child, "He built this place for you before you even existed, and now you'll build something new from it." Outside, the wind eased. The moon rose above the trees, spilling its pale light over the roof, across the attic window, down to the very spot where a single loose board had once hidden a secret. The house exhaled, and in that breath, she felt peace, an invisible thread of understanding that bound the past to the present. Tomorrow, she knew, they would begin again, not as guests in an old memory, but as a family reclaiming their story. The morning came slowly, wrapped in fog that drifted from the lake and curled around the trees. The woman woke first, her eyes adjusting to the gray light seeping through the curtains. Her husband still slept beside her, the faint rise and fall of his chest echoing the quiet rhythm of the house. The letter lay on the nightstand, where she had placed it the night before, folded with reverence. The paper looked fragile in the soft light, like it might dissolve into dust if touched too roughly. She reached out, brushed her fingertips across it, and smiled faintly. The words written there no longer felt like relics. They were alive, stitched into the fabric of the home itself. She rose carefully, her back stiff from the weight she carried and the work she had done the day before. Downstairs, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine sap. The fire had gone out overnight, leaving behind the scent of burned cedar. The kitchen was just as they had left it, the box on the table, the bolt cutter resting nearby, the chairs pulled close together. The quiet seemed deeper now, not empty, but full, like the stillness after a confession. She poured herself a cup of water and stepped to the window. Outside, the fog blurred the world into soft grays. The trees were only shapes, the lake invisible. Yet she could hear it, a low, steady lapping, a sound like breathing. When her husband joined her later, the lines around his eyes looked softer. The heaviness in his shoulders slightly eased. He kissed her forehead, murmuring a simple good morning, then glanced toward the box. "I dreamed about him," he said after a pause. He was standing out by the shed, just watching, not saying anything, but I knew he wasn't angry. His voice faltered for a moment, and then he added quietly, "He looked proud." She placed her hand over his. "Maybe he was waiting for this," she said, "for you to come home, for the house to wake up again." They decided that day to start repairing the attic. It had always been the coldest, dustiest part of the house, a place no one had touched since his parents died. Now it felt different. It wasn't just a space above them. It was a heart, beating faintly, ready to breathe. He carried up planks and paint. She followed more slowly, holding a small basket of brushes and cloth. The air inside was still cool, but cleaner now that the old insulation was gone. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, breaking into thin golden beams that illuminated the floating dust. He stood for a while, looking at the spot where she had found the box. The floorboard had been nailed back into place neatly, and the wood around it had been sanded smooth. "Right there," he said softly. "He must have hidden it before I was born." She nodded, resting a hand on the beam beside her. and maybe he wanted it to be found only when the house was ready. They worked slowly. He repaired the cracks in the beams, and she brushed away layers of dust from the walls. The rhythm of their labor became almost meditative. The tap of nails, the scrape of a brush, the faint hum of her breathing. Every sound echoed gently in the attic's hollow. She caught herself humming once, an old lullaby her mother had sung to her, and the sound seemed to linger longer than it should, curling around the rafters. He looked up and smiled faintly. "That song," he said. "My mother used to hum it too." She stopped, startled, then laughed quietly. "Maybe houses remember melodies," he shrugged. "Or maybe people just carry them wherever they go." By midday, they had finished sanding the wood along the eastern wall, and the attic smelled of raw pine. He opened the small round window to let the air circulate. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing the lake glittering faintly beyond the trees. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his work. The baby shifted, pressing gently against her ribs. "It's strange," she whispered, "how it feels like he's here. Not in a haunting way, but watching. Like he's grateful we're doing this." Her husband paused, set down his hammer, and nodded. "I know. I keep expecting to hear him downstairs, moving around, checking on us. That's how it feels, like he's just in another room." They spent the following days finishing the attic, turning it into a place of light and warmth. The cracked boards were replaced with new ones, the walls painted a soft shade of cream. She chose it because it caught the morning sun and made the space glow. He built a simple wooden crib, using his father's old tools. The process was slow and careful, every movement filled with intention. When he smoothed the final edge with sandpaper, he ran his hand along the surface, and for a moment his eyes glistened. "He'd laugh if he saw me," he said. "He used to say I didn't have the patience for woodwork." She smiled. "Maybe he taught you anyway, without meaning to." Evenings became their quiet ritual. They would sit together by the fire after dinner, reading or simply listening to the house. It had a new sound now, a subtle warmth beneath the silence, as though the walls had begun to expand again after years of holding their breath. When the wind brushed against the windows, it no longer moaned, but sighed softly, like an old voice speaking in gratitude. Sometimes they would find small things, a button under a floorboard, a coin between the planks, a child's marble hidden behind a trunk, and each discovery felt like another whisper from the past. One night, as rain began to fall softly against the roof, the woman woke with a sharp, familiar pain. At first she thought it was the weight of the child shifting again, but then another contraction came, deep and strong. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. She reached out and touched her husband's arm. "It's time," she said, her voice trembling. He stirred, then sat up, blinking away sleep. "Now?" She nodded, gripping the edge of the blanket. "It's too early," he asked, panic flickering in his voice. She shook her head. "No, just soon." He rushed to gather their things, speaking half-formed sentences about the hospital, about the car, about the storm outside. But the road was already flooding, and the rain fell heavier with each minute. The sound of it drummed against the roof like 100 hands. When he realized they couldn't safely leave, he stopped moving and looked at her helplessly. She was calm, breathing slowly through the contractions. "Here," she whispered. "It has to be here." He nodded, not arguing, and moved quickly. He brought clean sheets, towels, warm water, everything he could think of. She leaned against the wall near the fireplace, her body trembling, her breath shallow but steady. The flames flickered higher as the wind howled outside. Between the thunder and the rain, The house seemed alive, creaking, breathing, speaking in the language of the storm. He knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort that neither of them would remember later. Hours passed in fragments. There was pain, fierce and raw, and yet within it, something luminous, a feeling that time itself had paused to watch. When the child's first cry broke the storm's rhythm, it filled every room like a note of music long withheld. She leaned back, exhausted, tears on her cheeks, and saw him holding the baby in trembling hands. His face broke open with awe. "He's here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's here." They wrapped the newborn in one of the soft blankets his mother had once made. The baby's skin was warm and pale, his breathing quick and light. The sound of him crying softened into small murmurs. She touched his forehead, marveling at the fragile strength of his heartbeat. "He was right," she murmured. "Your father. He said when a child's laughter filled this house again, he'd know we'd forgiven him." Her husband looked at her, eyes full of wonder and something like peace. "Then he knows," he said. When the storm finally ended, dawn came pale and golden, spilling light through the cracks of the old wooden window. The house smelled of rain and warmth and life. The woman sat in bed, the baby asleep against her chest, while her husband stood by the window, watching the mist lift from the lake. Outside, everything seemed freshly washed, as if the world itself had been renewed. He turned toward her and smiled. "He'll grow up here," he said. "He'll learn the smell of pine and sawdust, just like I did. But he'll also know laughter, not silence." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "This is where it begins." Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their days settled into something new. The baby's cries echoed softly through the rooms, blending with the creak of floorboards, the whistle of wind, the quiet hum of everyday life. The woman would often sit by the window in the afternoons, rocking the child while sunlight moved across the floorboards. She could feel the pulse of the house around her, the warmth of the walls, the gentle sigh of the wood expanding with each day. It no longer felt like a place of ghosts. It felt alive, anchored by the small heart beating against her chest. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the trees, she carried the baby up to the attic. Her husband followed, his hand resting lightly on her back. The attic was bright now, filled with soft golden light. The walls gleamed faintly, and the small crib stood in the corner, the wood smooth and honey-colored. Above it hung a small framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day, smiling as though they knew they would be remembered. On the opposite wall, the letter from his father was framed too, its words preserved behind glass. She placed the baby gently in the crib, and he stirred, but didn't cry. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, and she leaned down to kiss his forehead. Her husband stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They stood in silence, listening to the faint sounds of the forest outside, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the cry of a distant bird, the steady beat of their own breathing. The light shifted slowly, fading into the soft hues of dusk. She turned her head slightly, resting against him, and whispered, "He built this place for us long before we knew it. Maybe houses remember love too." He nodded, his voice low and sure. "Maybe love is what keeps them standing." As night fell, they lingered in the attic, unwilling to break the moment. Downstairs, the fire crackled to life on its own draft, the sound of the wood popping faintly, a heartbeat within the walls. The baby slept peacefully. The letter glowed faintly in the last light, and the house exhaled once more. A deep, contented sigh, as if after decades of silence, it could finally rest. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both understood that what had begun as an act of rebuilding had become something else entirely. It was not just the restoration of walls and beams, but the quiet resurrection of memory, forgiveness, and belonging. The house had not been waiting for new paint or fresh nails. It had been waiting for a family to come home. Now it had one. Outside, the moon rose high, silvering the roof and the lake below. Inside, the air was warm, alive with breath and the faint echo of generations. The woman closed her eyes, hearing the soft rhythm of her son's breathing, blending with the old heartbeat of the home. For the first time, everything was still, complete. The house that had slept for half a lifetime had finally remembered how to live. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every house holds a story worth remembering.